welcome everyone to this year's Margaret Lindquist Sorensen Lecture. This lectureship was established in 1978 by a gift from the son of Margaret Sorensen, Andrew Sorensen, BD, class of '62. The lecture provides an annual venue for consideration of politics and ethics. Until her death in May 2002 at age 87, it was Dr. Sorensen's custom to attend this annual lecture with his mother. Due to a busy travel schedule as president of the University of South Carolina, Dr. Sorensen regrets that he is unable to be with us today, as he usually is. Previous Sorensen lecturers have included Sheldon Wolin, Father Brian Hare, David Hollenbach, Senator John Danforth, Representative David Price, and former Dean of the Law School here, Guido Calabresi, to name just a few. To introduce today's Sorensen lecturer, I'd like to call on Jerry Streets, Yale University chaplain and a colleague of Dr. Malika.
Dr. Richard F. Malika, as a scholar, teacher, and practicing psychiatrist, passionately argues that those who come to physicians, therapists of various kinds, and the clergy for help do so as whole persons who are trying to give meaning to what they are experiencing. He invites them to teach us what they consider is of utmost importance to them and about who they are and how they deal with their suffering. He integrates into his perspective of caring for others a knowledge of traditional science-based medicine and sensitivity to their cultural and spiritual practices and religious beliefs. Dr. Malika has transformed mental health care by including in the practice of primary medicine and mental health services an understanding and treatment of mental health concerns of those affected by war and natural disasters. He has done this work in Boston and New Haven and places around the world, including Cambodia, Japan, Africa, Italy, Chile, Peru, Rwanda, Spain, Greece, and Bosnia. I continue to learn from him since our relationship began here as students over 30 years ago, and it has been an honor to work with him here in the U.S. and in Bosnia. A graduate of Reed College in Oregon, the University of New Mexico Medical School, and Yale Divinity School, Dr. Malika, professor of psychiatry, Harvard University, has published hundreds of articles, and his training curriculums and screening instruments have been translated into over 30 languages. His essay, Invisible Wounds, published in the Scientific American, gained worldwide attention. He has been a Fulbright Scholar and a Fulbright New Century Scholar. He has lectured around the world and received numerous awards and citations for his work. Named a lifelong visiting professor by Waseda University in Japan, Dr. Malika's contributions to mental health care has been featured on ABC's Nightline. He and his wife, Dr. Karen Mollica, also a physician, have two sons, Nicholas and Christopher. We are delighted that he and Karen, with friends and colleagues from Harvard, are with us today. And we welcome Dr. Malika, my friend, a healer in the true sense of the word, back to Yale.
Thank you for that incredible opening remarks. I want to thank Dr. Sorensen, he's not here, and his family, Dean Attridge, Dr. Streets, a beloved friend and colleague of mine, and the distinguished guests for this opportunity to give this lecture today. I am very honored to, when I first received the letter from Yale Divinity School, I was thrilled, as I told my wife, who actually goes by the name of Karen Carlson, but that's okay, she's who I just said, this is very exciting because it was always one of my dreams to return to Yale and give a lecture. I don't know why I had this in my mind since I was a student here, because you have to remember, I was a part-time student at Yale Divinity School for 5 years, because I was 3 years in the Department of Psychiatry, 2 years in epidemiology, and so I had to come over here, once or twice a week, take my classes, and sort of chipped away at my degree over a 5-year period. And I think the 5-year experience is pretty remarkable, because you actually have a 5-year training, although you get a 2-year degree. So I'd recommend this, that this is really not a bad way of indoctrinating your students, because I've always, the only hat I wear is the Yale Divinity School hat. And I just happened to lose it in Italy a couple of weeks ago, and I feel very sad about that. So I'm going to buy one before I leave. I asked Grace Pauls, I said, where can I get a Yale Divinity School hat? Because I lost mine, But I wanted to thank, before I get started, I don't want to take up most of my time, is that Sister Margaret Farley was really a seminal person and a mentor to me many years ago, and really was the one who taught me phenomenological philosophy and ethics, which is the foundation for this lecture that I'm giving today. I mean, the whole use of phenomenology really was the basis for discovering the new ideas in working with survivors of mass violence and torture. Also, that time, Jerry and Streets and I were a lot younger. We were in Jim Washington's class on the history of the black church, and Jerry's played also a very important role around trying to help me understand the sociology of racism and the meaning of racism, no matter what your color of your skin is or your background and ethnicity. Also, Henry Nouwen, the late Henry Nouwen, insisted that I meet him at 4 a.m. in the morning for his class. I don't know if you still have classes, Dean, at 4 a.m. in the morning, but in those days, to meet Henry for class, you had to get up, and because he had just finished his meditation and everything, and he wanted to have a fresh start, so I had to wake up. But usually I'd come from the emergency room and go straight over. He didn't know this, that I was already up, So, and then finally, I have to thank very much my professor and mentor who died a year ago, Professor Fritz Redlich, who died at 91 here at Whitney Center, who really was one of my greatest sources of inspiration until the day he died, was still talking about the importance. He always said to me, the most important thing is for a doctor to be able to make policy, to contribute to policy, to contribute to the greater good of the greatest number. And of course, when you're a young man and you hear a great man like Fritz say this, who wants to listen to a young person? Nobody. So when you're very young, Fritz is pushing us to make policy, to try to influence policy was meaningless. It didn't mean anything. And then I began to realize as I aged, and I've been doing this work now 25 years, that you have to show the leadership, you have to step forward, that doing what Fritz wanted me to do took some courage, was not easy. For a doctor to be involved in public policy, you have to show leadership. You have to find within yourself the passion to contribute to other people instead of staying within your clinical box or your neurosciences box, etc. So I want to really also deliver this lecture in honor of the late Fritz Redlich, who died New Year's Eve of last year. Now, if I can show, I want to begin with a very brief film, a 2-minute film, provided to me by my Cambodian colleagues who are here. And this film was taken in the refugee camps in Thailand in 1979. The Khmer Rouge had swept over Cambodia. 2 million people were in the process of being killed. These people had escaped into Khao Dong, a refugee camp on the Thai border. And these young people are acting out their experience. They're acting out their experience of something that had just happened to them months before. Yeah.
are asking her to stand. Institutional counseling.
Okay, great, thank you. I worked in these camps. In fact, our early experience was in Site 2, the largest camp in the Thai-Cambodian border. And think of your community, New Haven, named Site 9. This camp of 170,000 men, women, and children was named Site 2. Sort of strange when you think about it, that a whole community of human beings would be named after a number. But this was Site 2, and this is the kind of things that one saw in Site 2. People fresh out of a genocidal experience where average Cambodian had suffered 16 major trauma events, as we subsequently learned through our research. So I was searching, really searching. I've been doing this work for 25 years. I've interviewed over 10,000 survivors of mass violence and torture, not all patients. And one issue kept on coming up, and that was the issue of fear. Fear. Fear of the survivor, fear of the trauma, fear of being infected by their hopelessness and despair. In other words, the healing. I wanted to make this lecture sort of relevant to people in pastoral counseling, also in theology. The fear that we confront as healers, as priests, as religious people, in confronting things beyond our kind of comprehension, things that are horrible, terrible, that we can't imagine that human beings can do to each other. But we see it every day in the newspaper, of course. So it took me a long, long time to try to get a handle on this fear, because I had this fear within myself. And I just happened to see this fantastic painting by Raphael. Raphael, the Transfiguration. And I was very pleased that the people at the Vatican allowed me to break into the Vatican Museum and have a private viewing of this painting, And I'd like you to focus on the bottom part of the painting, because in the top part of the painting, Jesus is, for the first time, is transfiguring himself into God. We get to know Jesus as God. But in the bottom part of the painting, this is the genius of Raphael. This is the next scene in the gospel, where Jesus is coming after his transfiguration and is saying to his apostles, how did it go with the healing of this child? How did it go with the healing of this child? How did you do it? He's sort of checking out whether the apostles were able to heal. So can you see the healing there? The boy who looks like he has epilepsy, but in the New Testament it would be a demon, as the Christians shifted from epilepsy to demon as the source of illness. So here in the next slide, you can see the faces of the healers, the apostles. They're afraid. I saw in these faces feelings that I had in myself and that my staff and my colleagues have in confronting the problem of mass violence and torture. Someone who's been tortured. I saw in the faces of these apostles the same feelings that I've had within myself and my colleagues. Look at this beautiful, these are little sub-pieces of the beautiful pieces from this gorgeous painting. So if you ever have a chance to see this painting, try to appreciate this scene. Now, there's very little written about this part of the Transfiguration, about the Transfiguration as a whole, but I think that, look at these faces here. Incredible, looking at the child, the healers looking at the child suffering from epilepsy. And this is what you often feel in your clinical practice. hopelessness, despair, possibility of really someone comes to you, they've had 60 members of their family killed. What can you do? And then here's the picture of the community around the child. The community around the child. And this is a beautiful, beautiful scene of one of the community members. You can see the fear, the dread, the terror in the community member. And this is like the little Cambodian film, witnessing those kids playing out the genocide they had experienced. And then finally you have this incredible image of the child, the suffering child. I just find it so moving. This is really... I didn't, Rabini and I, when we went to the FOG to get these slides, I mean, I had never seen so beautifully, so perfectly, the face of the child possessed by the demon. It's incredible, isn't it? I mean, Raphael really, really understood what he was painting about. Now, let me read to you. I'll be doing a lot of reading of stories, trauma stories, but let me begin with this, the quote from Matthew 17, verse 14 to 21. And when they came to the crowd, a man came up to him, kneeling before him, and said, "Lord, have mercy upon my son, for he is an epileptic, and he suffers terribly. For often he falls into the fire, and often into the water. And I brought him to your disciples, and they could not heal him." See, this is the Father saying, the disciples could not heal him, you see. And Jesus answered, "O faithless and perverse generation, how long have I been with you? How long am I to bear with you? Bring him here to me." So I think Jesus is a little cross about the fact that the apostles hadn't healed this child. And Jesus rebuked him, and the demon, he said, "Bring him here to me." And Jesus rebuked him, and the demon came out of him, and the boy was cured instantly. Then the disciples came to Jesus privately and said, "Why could we not cast it out? Why could we not cast it out?" And then he said to them, and this is famous, of course, one of the famous lines from the New Testament. He said to them, "Because of your little faith, for truly I say to you, if you have faith as a grain of mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, 'Move hence to yonder place,' and it will move, and nothing will be impossible to you." Now, in this beautiful passage, the mustard seed also represents for me the survivor who doesn't know the future. The mustard seed knows the future. Most survivors you treat do not know the future. It looks black. They don't know what's up ahead. And so they have to have faith, just as the doctor must communicate the faith that there is a future, because they cannot see what's up ahead. Now, I want to put in my comments, because I'm going to talk a little bit about the trauma story in a very different way than usual. I thought this would be useful to you. This is the WHO definition of health. I mean, most of you have seen it. This is fairly routine. But I don't like this definition. I think it's very passive, it's outdated, and it's static. This is the definition we came up with based on a women's health clinic in India. And in this definition, it says, health is a personal and social state of balance and well-being in which people feel strong, active, wise, and worthwhile, where their diverse capacities and rhythms are valued, where they may decide and choose, express themselves, and move about freely. If you're a woman in a society in which you're receiving domestic violence on a regular basis, can you be healthy even though your body is physically healthy, your laboratory tests are healthy, your physical exam is healthy? According to this definition, you cannot be healthy. You cannot be healthy. This is the dynamic definition of health. And through this whole lecture, I want to constantly be emphasizing dynamic actions, dynamic definitions, and move away from stasis. Just like we don't want to get stuck in the picture of the Transfiguration, of looking in fear on the child and not being able to do anything. Now, I want to sort of begin to break this down around the trauma story, because we first in our group started talking about the trauma story in the mid-1980s, and we realized that every patient had his trauma story and they wanted to tell their story. But then we began to discover that the trauma story is in the physical examination, the trauma story is in the psychological examination, the trauma story is in the social experience, and the trauma story is definitely in the spiritual experience. Now, I don't have time, and we've written lots about this around the identification and diagnosis and care of these different elements of the trauma story. I mean, this is a sort of a discovery. Foucault said the body is imprinted by history. And all the evidence is that your torture in your body reflects that historical experience, even at the molecular level. So this is another discussion for another time. But what I want to talk about is the fact that the trauma story phenomenologically seems to have 4 elements to it. And why we discovered this is that we began interviewing Cambodian women oral historians in the early 1980s, and we've done hours and hours of oral history, thousands of pages of transcript. And these oral historians were not patients, they were citizens, and we've extended this oral history method to other populations. We had a problem. We used the phenomenological method of Margaret Farley, and basically we said, let's throw out psychiatric assumptions. Let's throw out socialism. Let's bracket these things, and let's not go into the trauma story with already preconceived notions. In the Cambodian trauma story, we're going to find this, and we're going to find the death instinct and images of death, and all kinds of stuff. We said, get rid of it all. We're just going to listen to the trauma story as an historical oral history and see what we come up with. And lo and behold, at the end of 15 years, we were completely paralyzed. We had these incredible, magnificent stories, and we had no interpretation of these stories. But that was our rule. No psychobabble, psychoanalysis, nothing. We wanted to approach it fresh. Well, what emerged was that there's a structure. If you leave the trauma story alone, 12 hours of a trauma story, there's a structure that emerges. There's a skeleton to it, an archaeology. And these are the 3 elements. The first 4 elements. The first element I call looking behind the curtain. Now, is the facts. The first element is called facts, factual current events. So it's very common in people when they tell their trauma story to tell you the facts. On April 25th at 3 o'clock, the Khmer Rouge came in and blah, 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 blah. And then in Rwanda, people tell you the facts. I'll give you an example from the oral history. This is a Cambodian woman who was a dancer from a middle-class family, a royal dancer, and she's talking about the facts of her experience with her children in the concentration camp. From that time on, 3 or 4 months in the Khmer Rouge camps, my littlest daughter started to get very, very sick. She had diarrhea. I was lucky that I had a soldier who had a crush on me. He would often come to visit me. I begged him. I would do anything just to get the medicine for my children. At that time, he did give me penicillin. I did not give it. I did not think it would heal my daughter, but it's better than nothing. So I gave it to her, but her condition continued to get weaker and weaker. Our food was getting lower and lower, so I was getting weaker and weaker. To watch my daughter, it starts to, she misses her home, she misses her toys, she misses her food, and she starts to complain and talk day and night all the time. She's gone. She's gone. That night I held on to my daughter's body. Our whole family was very quiet. Nobody wanted to say anything. She was the first one to die in the family. It started from her. I saw my father start to change his attitude. Instead of always being playful, he lost his sense of humor. So this is, you can, from 5 oral historians, you can learn the facts of any brutal regime. Excuse me. Let me go back to this. Cultural meaning of trauma. What does that mean? Briefly, that means that every trauma story is an anthropologist. You can only tell your story through your own culture. As a Cambodian woman, you can only tell it as a Cambodian woman. As a Rwandan man, you can only tell it as a Rwandan man. First time I heard women talking about arranged marriage, I didn't have a clue what they were talking about. But I began to understand that for them, it was normal to talk about arranged marriages because they were all from arranged marriages. So the trauma story also is a mini ethnography. And you can learn from this ethnography. Here's an example of it from the same woman, the Cambodian dancer. It is horrible. I buried my parents with my own hands. Like I said, used to put the body in beautiful clothes. So she's now talking about how Cambodians do burial. The favorite clothes that the person used to like before they died. Okay, you would give them a bath, right, and then you'd put them in beautiful clothes. You'd put on them a little bit of makeup, and if the body is a mother, and the mother died and the baby is still alive, sometimes you would put a watermelon with the body to pretend it was a baby. See, so we're getting an anthropology or an ethnography of burial in Cambodian culture. Luckily, when my mother died, I could wrap her in beautiful clothes. A horrible thing happened to her 2 or 3 days after I buried her. Somebody told me that this, and this is still a nightmare to me, that a wolf was able to go through her grave because they did not bury her deep enough. How would you feel if you were me? She was the favorite person in my life. She died, and you thought she was in peace. Even the body cannot stay in peace. Now, the Cambodians believe in spirits, and they believe that the spirit of a desecrated body cannot come to rest. So her mother's spirit was not at rest after being dug up by the wolf and eaten, you know. So this is, we're learning very much from these few sentences. We have you could do a thesis just on these, 2 sentences, this small paragraph about Cambodian burial ritual and studying it, and the meaning of spirituality in the loss of someone we've loved. Now, the next part I call looking behind the curtain comes from my experience at Divinity School. So I actually did learn something at Divinity School. I read then Thomas Merton's contemplative prayer. I was engaged with Henry now in the prayer experience, and I found it frightening. I mean, there was something around being involved in a serious way in prayer that's terrifying, and you can read Thomas Merton to understand why. And I'm sure many of you have been down this road. But looking behind the curtain means there was an introduction to Merton's book where the Douglas Steer says, prayer is like the curtain on a stage, and through the prayer you get to look behind to what's really going on. You look behind the curtain to the stage. I love that metaphor, and I began to see that the people I've worked with over the past 25 years, they have revelation. They don't just take everything society says to them for granted. especially women. Women have been sexually abused. You know, they're ostracized. Some are killed, like in Bangladesh. You know, they're thrown out of the family. They're considered impure, etc. I cannot tell you how many people have said this. Women have said this to me in our private conversations. You know what, Dr. Malika? All that cultural stuff is nonsense. I'm not a criminal. I did nothing wrong. Why is my society treating me so poorly? I get it, you know, I understand it, and the revelation comes. This is looking behind the curtain. Every survivor, everyone who's been traumatized, has a revelation, has revelations. If you don't believe this, you're missing one of the key elements, the learning elements of the trauma story. Trauma story really, for me, begins with looking behind the curtain. But we tend to focus on the facts, as we'll see in a few minutes. Listener-storyteller relationship is very basic, it's very modern, is that we know that in every relationship that you participate in, you become part of that person's life. I mean, so if you're a doctor, you become part of the patient's life. Patient becomes part of your life. If you're doing oral histories with Cambodian women, you enter into their story. They enter into your story. So I think that this is very, very important to understand. I'm sure, you know, this has been part of the modern discourse for years, you know, that you can't be involved in someone else's life without becoming part of their story. And of course, many NGOs and others sometimes get involved at a charity trying to help other people. And in fact, in helping other people, they actually hurt other people. Good people can do bad things. But this is because they're not paying attention to their good people, but what kind of people are they in the story of the other person? The other person may be thinking that they're bad people because they've been injured by it. You understand? You have to, and vice versa. We have to understand how, I'm talking about the fear of the apostles, how we are affected by the other person ourselves. Now that we've laid out the content of the trauma story, something becomes readily apparent. Traumatized people were not, it became apparent to us that traumatized people were not successfully communicating their trauma story. Traumatized people are not often good storytellers. This is a whole other discussion I don't want to get into. But we learned to be trauma story coaches. This may sound a little ridiculous to you, but in a more dynamic way we said, we have to help people tell the full trauma story. And I'm going to give you in a few minutes an example of 3 trauma stories, and you can pick and choose the ones that you think are effective. Because if you can't communicate your pain and suffering to others, your experience, your revelations to others, you're losing something. And society very easily has a tendency to marginalize a traumatized person. So we began to look at Nelson Goodman. Nelson Goodman is a late philosopher at Harvard who focused on the meaning of art. You know, how does art create art? How does art create the world of art? And in this case, Goodman said worlds, artistic worlds, and I use this in my work in terms of traumatic worlds. Traumatic worlds are galaxies in transition. Trauma affects a life world, and the life world goes through these transitions, the galaxies in transitions. I like to visualize it this way. Goodman talked about 3 elements to creating a world, artistic world. And in our program, we do a lot of work with the trauma story as a work of art. And the doctor's appreciation, the nurse's appreciation aesthetically, not clinically, of the life world of the person. And so here you have the 3 elements, symbolism, expressed emotion, and style. And so what Goodman said, and I think all trauma stories have this, is that you have symbolism. Usually trauma stories are not concrete, direct, mundane expressions of life experience. There's a lot of symbolism. In the Chinese people, for instance, tell trauma stories through fables, through fairy tales. There's a lot of metaphor. This is very important, the next one, because it's usually hooked up with our friend the facts. Express the motion. What is the emotion that the work of art of the story wants to pass on? There's an intentionality to this. When people are telling you a story, they have an emotion they want to deliver. At least one, maybe two. But there's an overlying emotion. And the third thing is style. I've listened to, as I told, over 10,000 stories, and Bosnians tell stories in a different way than Rwandans tell stories in a different way than Cambodians, and the beautiful nuances of the culture, the language, and the way people tell their stories is pretty much comes out through the style. So there's the style to telling a story, a trauma story. So this is a little model I put together for this lecture today. You have the facts, the cultural meaning of trauma, looking behind the curtain, listener-storyteller relationship. That's the complete story. And then you have the process, the symbolism, the emotions, and the style. So I thought this might be helpful as a way for you to begin to think about stories, listening to stories, analyzing and thinking about stories in a different way. Now you see there's no interpretation here. I'm not saying that the trauma story means this, or you're going to find death imagery in the story, or this. I don't believe in any of that. As I said, Margaret Farley told me to throw that all out. So as a phenomenologist, I'm much more happier with this phenomenological structure that you can use, and I think pretty well holds up. I mean, we've done a lot of phenomenological analyses, and what's nice about the phenomenological structure? It's respectful to the storyteller. Storytellers who I know who have been highly traumatized, they hate people interpreting their story. They don't like that. So they tell a story and say, well, I think as psychiatrists, and they go, forget it, I'm not going to talk to this guy again. It's crazy, this guy's crazy. People do not like to have their stories interpreted, especially if they're stories that have to do with violence in their own internal life world. I don't know if this makes sense, but it's a very delicate thing to, and I think a dangerous thing, to be telling people what their stories mean. On the other hand, this allows us to participate in a dynamic way, in a dialogue, in a discussion. See, this is part of a discussion. This is part of a dialogue. Now, I'm going to spend the next few minutes, oops, didn't want to show you that yet. I'm going to spend the next few minutes reviewing three stories. And I want you to think about, in these three stories, these different elements. Now, of course, I don't have time to develop a 12-hour oral history, so I have to give you little snapshots. But think about, this is a typical story you're going to hear now, told in a very common way by Amnesty International about a Chilean woman who was sexually abused. I have been interrogated 5 times, and every single time I was completely naked. They ordered me to take off my clothes. Yes, I was completely naked. During each of the 5 interrogations, I started menstruating, even though it wasn't the right time for it. Maybe it was due to the nerves. Anyway, it resulted in me always being covered with blood. There was always at best 5 torturers present, and they forced me to take off my clothes at the same time, always making me look at them in their eyes. They then humiliated me verbally in all possible manners, saying that they would rape me while they mauled me all over my body. It was extremely sexually humiliating, and they kept on making me look them in the eyes. They then lined themselves up in a row, making me walk in front of them as if it was a fashion show. Still making me look them in their eyes. It keeps on coming back to me that I had to keep on looking them in their eyes because it felt so incredibly humiliating. That's a very powerful short story. And here you can look at the elements of the story. I'm not going to go into my own analysis, but you can think about it. But this story, the Catholic woman in the mock fashion show, her beauty, a beauty pageant being imitated by torturers, and her experience of humiliation related to that. It's a powerful story. It's a very shocking story, very upsetting story. Now, this is a patient of mine. I'd like you to take a look at this. I'm not going to leave this up for too long because I find this very difficult to look at. But this was one of my first patients. He gave us permission to use this. His name is not on here. And one day he was strolling down the street in Boston, and he saw the Khmer Rouge man that had done this to his family in Boston. He went into almost like a psychotic state of rage and anger, and he went home and he painted this huge 4-foot painting. This is a painting he painted of, it shows you what happened to his family members. And he started carrying this painting around with him in a pouch that he had attached to his belt. He was newly married, had 2 children, and his wife couldn't deal with this because every night he'd come home and he'd paste this on the wall in the bedroom. This was the furniture of the house. So the wife finally came to us and said, I can't live like this. Can you imagine looking at this painting every day? A wife with 2 children trying to survive in Boston with a husband who's so enraged that he's painting this painting and carrying around with him and showing it to everybody. So he came into the clinic and, he'd take it out of his bag and he'd show it to us, the clinicians. Now I'm going to go back. I'm going to move back to this because I find that painting very disturbing. But as his doctor and my colleague, Ms. Wong Torres, we worked with him over about 3 or 4 years. We found every time he took the painting out, we found it disturbing. It was a shock. It was an assault. We actually felt brutalized. But we had very little experience with the trauma story at that time. This is sort of a unique trauma story, right? The style is a hammer to the head, right? The painting is shocking. The emotions that are brought up are overwhelming. The symbolism is primitive, But this was where this man was at, So finally, one day, my colleague pulled him aside and said, I want you to get rid of that painting. It's horrible, that painting. You're screwing up your therapy, you're destroying your wife and family. And then he began to cry. He said, I can't give up this painting. This is my family. This is all I have left. They're all dead. All I have is this painting. So we were just completely devastated by this, that this was all the man had left was this painting. But he also had his wife and 2 children and a new life. So this became, finally we confronted the brutality of this painting. And the upset, whenever he would come, we'd dread him coming. We'd say, oh God, we have to see that painting again, And he'd take it and show it to us, And then we'd be devastated for the rest of the day. Go, look at, And then we began to understand what was going on. And then once we allowed the man to share with us, that this was all that was left of his family, we were able to move into more constructive phase. How many people here think they could look at this in every therapy session? I mean, it's a horrible painting. It's hard. It was huge. It was big. So we were able to work this out with him, and he eventually put the painting away, and then we were able to start talking to him about other things. So that's another example of a trauma story in which the emotions are high and the facts are high. Now you're going to begin to see a pattern here, because in modern life today, that's what we seem to like: high emotions, high facts. We don't see in the news the Iraqi soldier, soldier in Iraq injured. This is what he can teach us about what happened to himself. These are his revelations. This is his spiritual side. People are arguing in the news, should the screams of someone who's being beheaded be shown on television, heard on television? Credible debates like this, because they're going for the facts and the emotions. I've worked with journalists now for 25 years, and they love facts, they love emotions. That's it. They don't seem to be interested in any other aspect of the trauma story, I'm sorry to say. And it's getting worse. Now, I'd like to, as we come towards the end here and leave a little time for questions, I'd like to read a story. Jerry Streets was very involved in this. This is we introduced the curriculum we had developed at Yale under David Duncan. Remember David Duncan? He was the chaplain at Yale Medical School. And Jerry and I introduced into Bosnia a new curriculum, a very exciting curriculum. It's called the Pedagogy of Trauma. And in this curriculum, we used the same method we used with the terminally ill, where the traumatized person is the teacher and the doctor is the student. So we said, let's just turn this all upside down. The trauma story is a teaching story, and the student is the doctor listening. So it was in the Theological Seminary, Franciscan Theological Seminary, School of Social Work, 3 medical schools. It was a very successful curriculum. And the students loved it because it really challenged everything they were being taught in medical school about how to listen to traumatized. In that country, half the population was displaced. 200,000 people were injured and 200,000 people were killed out of a population of 8 million. So there were traumatized people everywhere, including the doctors, young doctors. Now, I want to read to you what I consider a more holistic, more comprehensive story. The following case illustrates a successful telling of a very painful story by a teacher in our course, the course Jerry and I created with our staff. A citizen of Sarajevo to her student, a medical doctor at the University of Sarajevo. Maja was a young, educated woman from a middle-class Muslim family. She stated, and I'm going to give, again, mostly oral histories, all of my life I dreamed of meeting a person like Franjo. For the first time, I found myself in a relationship I did not want to break too soon. She told us that she did not trust men because her father drank too much and because her older sister's marriage had failed. She was also raising her nephew and did not want to get too involved with the man. Quote, I refused every relationship that would exclude my nephew. I could not find the right balance where someone would respect me or where I would respect the man. When she met Franjo, though, it was love at first sight. I mean, we understand it's love at first sight. You have to understand, she's a Muslim woman, he's a Croat Catholic. You would know by the names if you were in Bosnia. The fact that Franjo was a Croat and a Roman Catholic had no influence over Maja. She immediately realized he was an exceptional person. Again, she says, I was attracted to him because he was intelligent, good, generous, open, with a sense of humor, social, and gentle. He treated me with respect. The only thing I did not like was that he would drink sometimes and would openly say things others would not dare to say. In a way, he was in conflict because of what was happening in Bosnia to the Muslim people, my people. One day he came to our house and warned us. He said, Muslims are fasting and praying and they do not see what is waiting for them. He knew the genocide, the killing was going to begin, and he's warning them, wake up, Muslims, the Serbs are coming, the Croats are coming, they're going to kill you, The war broke out, and Maida briefly joined Franjo at his family house in Venetia, but because of her worry for the safety of her family, she returned to her home. As the conflict intensified, he was called away to help out with the war effort. Their contact was reduced, they lost touch. She was afraid their relationship would not last. Then she says, it was New Year's when my friend called. I was hoping she was going to wish me a Happy New Year. But she said, did you hear what happened to Franjo? He was killed. As if that did not reach my brain, I continued talking to her. Then she interrupted me and said, he was killed in an ugly way. It seemed they slaughtered him. I went to the bathroom and started to cry. I kept saying that it was not possible. Even now it seems like a bad dream. Later on, she found out he was killed by extremists from his own people. Because he was a devout Catholic, they killed him on Christmas Day. But she said, and this is the powerful part here of the revelation, she says, I still believe in the goodness of mankind, in humanity, honor in Bosnia, in all the good things Franjo tried to preserve. He gave his life against darkness and primitivism. He was a symbol of an educated man who loved his country. Some tell me that with his death they killed Bosnia as well, and that hurt me. She continued her reflections on the killers. This is really beautiful. She says, they tried to kill love amongst the people. This is beautiful. She says, they tried. See her telling the trauma story? She has a lot of insight. They tried to kill love amongst the people, and everything that was good in human relations. She understood the perpetrators perfectly. We never had religious hatred here. We celebrated in Bosnia all religious traditions equally. This was an attempt to destroy our traditions. Again, tremendous insight, People who only carried evil in themselves and who had damaged values did this. You say, so now she's giving an explanation. She's cutting right through all the nationalisms, the rationalizations, everything. She's saying, evil people did this, to slaughter a man, Catholic man, on Christmas Day because you don't agree with them. And then she says, they do not love people and are only after their selfish interests. So she refuses to buy into the nationalism that was spawning the conflict between the three groups. She rejects that. Very incredible young woman, Then she says, this is very inspiring. She says, I am still looking for his characteristics in other people. I learned that real value exists. It is just difficult to find in people. I am glad that I love the right man. I learned that only a small number of people are spiritually rich. With time, I have learned he is gone forever. I am going to stay the way I was when I met him. Incredible. I am going to stay the way I was when I met him. I'm not going to let this sour me, and create all the hatred and the anger that was perpetrated within that violence. Now, that, if you look at the trauma model, she was a teacher, asked to be a teacher, and she taught us. And she taught us in a beautiful way, and also she avoided, never when she spoke to us did she bring up the horror. She didn't describe the massacre or the terrible thing that happened to Franjo. She could have. Her style was gentle. She had tremendous insight. She was really a great storyteller. And the student doctor who listened to her really found this to be true. Now finally we asked her, we said, what do you think about the doctor-patient relationship? Framing the storyteller-listener relationship another way. She goes, as a teacher, she never took her attention away from her student doctor. When he asked her what kind of relationship she wanted with her primary care physician to the student, she added, I expect a relationship full of warmth, trust, and honesty. It is important for the doctor and patient to have a sense of openness, trust, and respect. These were the elements that she had discovered in her relationship with Franjo, and this is what she wanted in her relationship with her doctor. Very powerful, beautiful. So now, what does this all mean? I can't summarize 25 years of work, but, and this gives us a few minutes for discussion, is that I learned that when you look at the full trauma story in its completeness, it's a story of healing and survival. It's a pedagogical story. It's a teaching story. Trauma stories are teaching stories. They're not horror stories. Trauma stories teach, and their evolutionary purpose is to teach us about survival and healing. And unless you have the full story, you're not going to see this. Now, this is an example of exactly what I mean about the media and about hooking facts to emotion. This is a woman. I'm sure you all saw this in the New York Times. It was a huge picture in the New York Times on December 27th after the tsunami. The woman is screaming because a lot of those children there are, a lot of those people there, those ones lying dead there are children. So the caption says, woman showing grief or suffering, around her dead children. The children are naked, and then you can see the bodies of the other children, up ahead. I asked myself, I was enraged by this picture. I said, what's the purpose of this picture? I got it. I'm upset. I see the facts. But I don't see the woman here. And also, I think it was wrong to show naked children on the front page of the New York Times as in this kind of vicious way, To me, this was really, I was shocked that this was in the New York Times, really. But I see this every day, Every day people want this, Facts and emotions, facts and emotions, facts and emotions. And what happens with the facts and emotions is we get tired. People come up to me and say, Rich, you've been doing this work for 25 years. How can you deal with this? I say, I love my job. I guess the way I deal with it is I listen to the complete trauma story. I cannot tell you how much I learned from my patients, from my friends. I get the whole picture. But if I was dealing with the facts and emotions, facts and emotions, facts and emotions every day, I'd be, terribly depressed. And so I think that we need to think about the complete trauma story in a different way, because if we're going to transfigure ourselves as the apostles were asked by Jesus to do in healing of the epileptic child, we need to go about our business in a different way. Thank you very much. Questions, comments? Yes, please.
It's more of a clinical.
Do you need the microphone? I think you need to.
This is more of a clinical. Have you found that in working, I don't know if you've worked with this, but have you found in working with these people that some of the new mind-body, such as Peter Levine's work or EMDR, those kind of things are helpful with this severity of trauma?
Well, this is a very important question because there's no shoe, fits all. In the sense that the trauma story is very subtle. In the sense that I try to explain this. People say, well, are you in favor of the trauma story being expressed? Are you against it? Or do you like catharsis? Do you like EMDR where you use this kind of approach where there's a cognitive approach related to the story? And I say that depends on the person, their life, their situation, and the timing and the culture. You may find it shocking, but Cambodians don't like catharsis. Americans do. So culturally, if you try to Cambodian culture and all of our research is extremely avoidant. Something terrible happens, hey, put it behind you, move forward, you know. While in American culture, we have this thing about repetition and catharsis comes out of Freudian psychoanalysis, etc. And it's been hard for me, someone has 16 major trauma events, to decide, well, let's have a catharsis with this person, you know, I mean, especially in a culture that doesn't believe in catharsis, you know. So I think there's no real easy answer to this, because some people need catharsis sometimes in their life, other people need denial. You know, and there's a lot of grief work by Banana and others that clearly show that putting it out of your mind, using denial, and in our Bosnian studies of Bosnians over time, refugees over time, the natural inclination is for people naturally to push things out of their mind and get beyond it, you know. So, and that is not associated with more mental illness or more depression, you know. So it does seem, I think especially, let's talk about children for a minute, you know. This thing is very damaging to kids. You know, there's been a lot of research after 9/11 that all that stuff in the media created a lot of post-traumatic stress problems in children. And this tsunami thing as well, and the beheading stuff and everything, doesn't go over big with kids, in the sense that for a kid, they experience it as if it's actually happening in the house, the beheading's happening in the neighborhood, or, you know, it depends on the age of the child, obviously. But we also see with children that this kind of very superficial and flippant, constant presentation of 9/11 and then the beheading and all this other kind of stuff is really toxic to children. In fact, I've begun to call facts and emotions in a trauma story the toxic trauma story. This is my new name for it. I call it the toxic trauma story. So there are trauma stories that are toxic. And if you make the mistake that asking people to talk about themselves is benign at best, helpful, is either helpful or benign, you're wrong. Because by making people talk about things sometimes, you can throw them into an illness, you know, makes them ill. So there's no one size fits all, you know. Yes, Dean?
I want to go back to the film clip with which you started. It showed a group of children reenacting trauma. What was the social setting of that reenactment? Why were they doing that?
In the camp, you mean?
Mm-hmm.
10V, you want to respond to that?
Well, Team B asked me to take this one. That was filmed in 1979, and those children were unaccompanied minors. Basically, what had happened was a lot of them came out of the jungles and came into the camps without parents. And in some cases, parents put their kids over the fence so that they'd be fed. And so they were in these camps, and it was part of an effort to help the kids deal with their trauma was to have them do plays. They did a lot of music, a lot of dancing, and a lot of plays to help them deal with their trauma.
Yeah,
So
thank you.
they were asked to do
It's a little play,
drama
yes, right.
by the camp staff.
Right.
On the theory that telling the story would be therapeutic.
Well, this is 1979. I mean, you have to remember that in 1979 there was absolutely no psychology to any of this. I mean, this was, I think that there's always been a feeling that the arts, theater, puppetry, traditional arts, is therapeutic for people to share their experience through the arts. So this was a sort of a Western style play, you know. I don't know what the theory was, because people didn't have theories about this back then. They knew very little about it. In fact, when we went first to the refugee camps in late 1980s, because the Pol Pot ended in 79, these people came fleeing out by the hundreds of thousands. When we were there in the late 1980s, in these camps of almost 400,000 people, the UN, the NGOs, they did not believe that the Khmer had any psychological distress, that they had gotten over the Pol Pot period, you know. So that was the belief system, you know. I mean, it's interesting to see how these beliefs have changed over time, you know. So when we started asking Cambodians in the refugee camps in 1980 if they had any, you know, what their psychological problems were, camp the UN and others thought we were crazy. They said, "What are you doing? You know, just these people are recovered. They're fine. Everything is great. No problem." You know. I don't know if that answers your question, but here the blindness scene is very important. You know, because there's been a history of Cambodian people, women, becoming blind even though they have no physical illness. So that gets played out in this film too. The kids are showing the mother who's blind, but she probably doesn't have a blinding illness. So there's a whole psychology around seeing something so horrible that you become blind. There are cases like that. And I think we didn't answer your question, right?
Well, Richard, could I just say something?
Yeah, sure.
I was in the camp in Haiti,
Yeah.
and I was in another camp. I was in a camp that was a holding camp, which was a bit a ways from the border. But every refugee that I talked to, I mean, I didn't know about Pol Pot when I went there. And so the first couple of weeks, I was really stunned. I was shocked at what they were telling me. And then the next thing you want to do is do something with that story. And people, I would say, "God, that's an important story. You ought to write down that story." And they would say to me, "I'm sick and tired of you foreigners coming in telling us to write down the story." And it seems that there was a need to deal with the trauma story, and that as people going in as helpers, we were trying to say, your story has meaning. And what you're saying too, Richard, is really important. I'm glad I came tonight for this because it has great meaning for me. Is that the trauma story is important, and the trauma story is not the same as catharsis. It's not the same as therapy. It's their story, and it is helpful to them to tell it the way they want to tell it, and that it has meaning for them, and it's your job to just be the person who hears it, because they need to tell this to another human being, because nobody wants to hear this. When these people were in the camps, every day they were saying, "Pol Pot did this, Pol Pot did this, Pol Pot did this," and then they came over here, and everyone said, "Well, we got enough of that, you know, no more, don't talk about that anymore," and they stopped talking. And it's an important story.
It's, you know, I was talking to one of the students here in political science, you know, who's working on Truth Commission, and the trauma story is protean, you know, it's, you know, the proteus changing, you know, that's what I'm saying, it's nuanced. There's, I can't give you one answer for everything, because you have to really be an artist, you know, be sensitive to when's the right time to hear the story, when's the right time not to hear, you know. I mean, I'm sure as theologians and as pastors, you deal with this all the time, you know, if someone's going through a divorce, I mean, when's the right time to say, like, let's talk, and, you know, and I think that see, for us, the trauma story is essential in medicine, not only because you can find it in the lungs, the heart, and the brain, and every, you know, because it affects the body, you know, in different ways. Not in everyone, of course, but because how can you have a doctor-patient relationship with someone who went through 16 major trauma events, including rape trauma, and you know nothing about it? See? And this is common in American medicine. I mean, I work in primary health care. I mean, most doctors don't want to get too deep into this, you know. And you have to ask yourself the question, how can you, even if the torture experience has no impact on the medical, on any impact on the medical disease, the psychological problems, the social context, etc., which of course is not true, wouldn't you want to know that your patient had this kind of human experience? I do. What you do with it is another question. But it seems to me you have to, if someone's been through this kind of experience, it seems to me it's the beginning of a relationship is at least to know that something happened like that. I don't know what you think, what the audience thinks, but yes.
This is a different question. Is that
Yeah,
okay?
sure. Yeah, please.
In your experience, have you had much interaction interviewing perpetrators? And if so, in what ways do their trauma stories from the other side differ or parallel those of the victim?
Well, the perpetrator question is difficult because we have a concept that there are perpetrators. You know what I'm trying to say? Like Osama bin Laden, you know, there's sort of these boogeymen. And of course there are. Hitler, Pinochet, it goes on and on. But at the field experience, perpetrators also, in other words, if you make a list of all the perpetrators, child soldier, young 10-year-old murders his own parents, is he a perpetrator? You know, well, yes, but can a 10-year-old who's been forced into being a child soldier be accused and punished for being a perpetrator? You know, it's a very complicated story because almost every person who's in the war in Bosnia, there was no good guys. I mean, there was people on each side committing atrocities, murder, rape, you know, and so it's the whole issue of how far do people go? Do we really want to know how far they go when so many people have gone that far? You understand what I'm trying to say? So it's a very, very complicated question. I do think there are perpetrators, believe me, I do think. But I've interviewed a lot of people who are patients who believe they were perpetrators. You know, and that's a tough story because some of my patients I was most fond of actually were forced to commit crimes. So so we have in medicine we try to maintain this idea of medical neutrality. I mean, and maybe Sister Margaret Farley can talk about this. This is the biggest problem around in our field is how do you deal with people who have committed crimes as part of the torture experience, trauma experience? And what's your role as a physician? What position should you take? Throw them out of the clinic? It's a very complicated issue. Margaret, you want to say something about it? I mean, it's a very complicated issue, and we go back and forth in this all the time because we don't like the idea that we have perpetrators being treated in our clinic. You know? Not just in Boston, but in other parts of the world, Rwanda, Uganda. You know, it's a big issue for clinicians all over the world. You know, I didn't answer your question again. I know, but. Because it's a question, it's a dialogue, it's a question. One of the things we do, I don't know if you do this here at the Main School or you recommend it in pastoral counseling, is we, in morally ambiguous situations, of which we're in a lot, we have peer support groups to work through the ethical questions. We establish our own ethics because there's no rule book, you know. So a question like this around perpetrators is part of our circle of solidarity around dealing with patients. You know, so we establish standards. I don't know if you'd call this situational ethics. You know, that we make the ethics work for the situation, but the way we contain the fact that we're not going off into morally dangerous areas is we do it as a group. So maybe we could have a group delusion, but it's possible. Yes?
I have a question about the revelations.
Yes.
I wanted to know whether there were cross-cultural similarities or were there differences and gender differences in the revelation?
Yeah, well, thank you for asking that question. Women are, across the board, have the best insight. I mean, you know, I'm not just saying this to appeal to liberal-minded people at the Yale Domain School. But what I'm trying to say is that the power dynamics are such that I've seen in the past 25 years that the big revelations, you know, the big contributions, the wisdom come from the women. And a lot of it has to do with going from relative positions of no power, you know, and being the most abused in any given situation, you know, to all of a sudden coming out of it, surviving, and then all of a sudden, you know, saying, hey, look, I'm just going to speak out. So to answer your question, the revelations are often gender-based because the main torture of women is sexual abuse, and the main cultural bias against women has to do with taboos related to sexual abuse. So women are confronting this every day. You know, I'm raped, my husband beats me up, throws me out of the house, in some countries kills me, you know. So the women are dealing with this all the time. They're like, my culture says I've lost my sexual purity, but how can that be? I'm not a criminal, I didn't commit a crime, some guy comes in, rapes me in front of my children, and all of a sudden I'm a criminal, you know. So these revelations are constant, you know. But you also have to be careful because we create a very confidential environment so people can share the revelations without... A lot of our patients will not let anyone know but the therapist that they've been sexually abusing because they don't want anyone in the community knowing it. So sometimes revelations are also kept secret. You understand what I'm saying? They might become enlightened, but they're not going to go home and talk to their family about it.